RIMPAC looks simple from a distance. You see ships on the water, aircraft overhead, uniforms on the pier, and you can mistake the whole thing for a display of presence. That image is not wrong, but it is shallow. What a multinational maritime exercise really rehearses is not the fact that many nations can sail in the same broad area. It is whether those nations can think together, move together, support one another, and keep doing that when the plan meets friction. The public count matters because it tells you what the exercise actually is, not what people imagined earlier in the year. In its June 25, 2026 release, the U.S. Pacific Fleet said RIMPAC 2026 brings together 30 nations, more than 30 surface ships, 5 submarines, 15 national land forces, more than 206 aircraft, and 30,000 personnel around Hawaii from June 24 through July 31. Earlier April planning material said 31 nations. That difference is normal. Planning figures can change before the public count is locked. That June 25 release also calls RIMPAC 2026 the 30th iteration of a series that began in 1971. That history matters because it shows the exercise is not a one-off spectacle. It is a long-running method for building collective readiness, maritime security, and complex realistic training. Every iteration adds experience to a common memory. Every iteration also exposes how much still has to be learned when many independent forces try to act as one coalition. The sheer scale hides the real challenge. 30 nations around Hawaii is not just 30 flags in one place. It is 30 sets of laws, procedures, platforms, languages, expectations, and political constraints trying to fit inside a single operating framework. More than 206 aircraft, 5 submarines, and more than 30 surface ships do not automatically become an effective force simply because they are present at the same exercise. They become useful only when the human and technical systems around them can cooperate. That is why command relationships sit at the center of the rehearsal. In a coalition, it is not enough to know who is physically present. People have to know who can direct what, who can request what, who can clear what, and how decisions move through the chain. A maritime exercise is partly a rehearsal of authority. It tests whether command can flow cleanly across national lines without blurring sovereignty or slowing the mission to a crawl. The Pacific Fleet has said its planning conferences build relationships, synchronize objectives, and prepare forces to operate together. That part of the exercise is easy to overlook because it is less visible than ships at sea. It is also where a lot of the real work begins. Before anyone launches aircraft or maneuvers a ship, staffs compare assumptions, align priorities, and settle on the practical question of how the coalition will actually function. The conference is not a warm-up. It is the first layer of the operation. That layer matters because a coalition is built out of people before it is built out of hardware. Officers and enlisted personnel have to develop a shared sense of what the exercise is trying to do, what the main tasks are, and how success will be recognized. A national detachment can be technically competent and still not fit well into a combined effort if it does not understand the larger aim. The purpose of the planning phase is to reduce that gap before the pressure rises. Communications are the next test, and they are more than radios or networks. A multinational force has to share language in the deepest sense of the word. A simple term can carry different expectations from one navy to another. A message that sounds routine to one staff can sound urgent or incomplete to another. A coalition exercise rehearses whether the participants can speak with enough precision that a command intent does not get lost in translation. That includes data, not just words. Different ships, aircraft, and command centers may all have ways of seeing the same operational picture, but they do not automatically see it in the same format or at the same level of detail. Interoperability is the ability to exchange useful information and act on it together. It is not the same as every system being identical. The exercise is valuable because it reveals where information moves cleanly and where it stalls, gets reformatted, or needs human interpretation. Permissions matter just as much as messages. A coalition is never only a technical arrangement. It is a legal and political arrangement too. Some participants can share information, but not all information. Some can support each other in one mission, but not another. Some can act under one authority only after a particular approval process is satisfied. RIMPAC rehearses those boundaries in a real-world context so that the coalition learns where cooperation is easy, where it is constrained, and where it needs more work. That is why interoperability is not interchangeability. Two forces can be interoperable without being interchangeable. They can work together without being identical. A ship from one navy is not a substitute for a ship from another navy in any simple sense. A command system from one nation is not a perfect replacement for another nation's system. Interoperability means those differences can be managed. Interchangeability would mean the differences do not matter, and that is not the real world. The exercise also rehearses logistics, which is where coalitions are often won or lost in practice. A fleet can look impressive on day one and still become fragile if it cannot sustain itself. Fuel has to move, spare parts have to arrive, supplies have to be handled, accounted for, and distributed. Maintenance has to happen on time, Replenishment has to be planned well enough that platforms can keep working without needless delay. None of that is glamorous, but all of it is combat power. Maintenance is part of the point, because hardware that cannot be kept in service is just a promise. In a multinational exercise, the question is not only whether a system exists, but whether it can be supported across national lines under operational conditions. Can a coalition keep a ship functioning when the schedule is demanding and the equipment is not all from the same family? Can it recover from small failures without losing momentum? RIMPAC rehearses the answer by making sustainment part of the operating problem, not an afterthought. Medical support is another part of the rehearsal, and it is often more important than it first appears. Navy Medicine's July 2026 report gives a public example of a multinational medical symposium that exchanged knowledge and strengthened interoperability. That kind of work is not side business. It is how a coalition learns to care for its people across national systems, languages, and procedures. A force that can cooperate on medical support is a force that can endure stress more credibly and recover more reliably. The exercise also trains for maritime security, which is a broad term but a practical one. Maritime security includes the ability to operate in a region where the sea lanes matter, where civilian shipping matters, and where the integrity of the maritime environment matters. It is about presence, awareness, cooperation, and the ability to respond to problems without turning every problem into a crisis. In coalition terms, it means partners can share responsibility for keeping the maritime space usable and stable. Sea control is different, though related. If maritime security is about keeping the sea usable, sea control is about the ability to use it effectively for your own purposes, while limiting the same ability for an adversary. RIMPAC's public descriptions include sea control because a coalition needs to practice not just presence, but coordinated action under pressure. That does not mean rehearsing every tactical detail in public. It means learning how combined forces can support one another when the environment is contested. Air defense is part of that same picture. A maritime coalition does not operate in a purely horizontal world. Aircraft, missiles, sensors, and command networks all make the air domain inseparable from the sea domain. The exercise therefore rehearses how ships, aircraft, and staffs coordinate so that the whole force is more aware and more resilient than any single platform could be alone. Air defense in coalition form is as much about information sharing and timing as it is about hardware. Anti-submarine warfare adds another layer of difficulty because it is an area where uncertainty is built into the problem. Subsurface operations demand patience, coordination, and the disciplined use of different capabilities. RIMPAC's inclusion of anti-submarine warfare tells you the exercise is meant to handle complexity, not just visibility. It asks whether partners can combine sensors, procedures, and judgment in a way that lets them track and manage a difficult problem without turning the exercise into a set of disconnected national efforts. Mine clearance training serves a similar purpose from another angle. Maritime access is never automatic. A safe route has to be established and maintained. Coalition partners need to know how to cooperate when a waterway or harbor area must be assessed and made usable. That is not just a technical matter. It is also a trust matter, because one nation has to believe another nation's procedures and findings enough to operate confidently alongside them. Disaster relief is part of the public RIMPAC descriptions for a reason. The same coalition that rehearses high-end maritime tasks also has to be able to respond when nature, infrastructure failure, or large-scale disruption creates a humanitarian need. That does not dilute readiness, it broadens it. A force that can coordinate relief, movement, communications, medical support, and logistics under pressure is practicing many of the same muscles it would need in a more violent crisis. Humanitarian assistance and disaster response belong inside a serious exercise because they reveal how quickly a coalition can become useful to people. Moving aid is not the same as moving force, but it relies on many of the same systems. You still need command relationships. You still need communications. You still need logistics, access, and medical coordination. If those systems can work under humanitarian pressure, they are more likely to work under military pressure as well. This is also where trust shows its value. Coalition trust is not a vague feeling. It is an operational asset built through repetition, transparency, and the willingness to work through friction honestly. Nations trust one another more when they have seen one another solve real problems together. An exercise creates small moments of proof. A message arrives correctly. A shared plan is executed. A support request is answered. Those are the building blocks of confidence. Friction is inevitable, and that is why the exercise matters. Equipment will not always line up perfectly. Terminology will not always be identical. Authorities will not always be equally broad. Weather, timing, and human error will all create complications. A coalition rehearsal tests whether those complications become failures or simply delays. That is a much more useful question than whether everything looked smooth when the first unit arrived. Decision-making under uncertainty is one of the deepest things the exercise rehearses. When information is incomplete, when a report is ambiguous, or when a partner's system delivers a different picture than expected, Commanders and staffs have to keep moving without pretending the uncertainty does not exist. RIMPAC gives participants a chance to practice that discipline. The goal is not to eliminate uncertainty. The goal is to keep coherence even when certainty is not available. There is also political work here, and it should not be minimized. Operating as a coalition means balancing national sovereignty, alliance expectations, domestic audiences, and the need to show credible cooperation. Every participant brings its own political context. Every participant also has to leave the exercise able to explain why cooperation mattered and what it achieved. That is part of why multinational exercises are valuable. They rehearse not just operations, but the political legitimacy of working together. Land forces matter in a maritime exercise because maritime operations are never isolated from shore. Ports, airfields, medical facilities, staging areas, and sustainment networks all connect the sea to the land. The inclusion of 15 national land forces in the June 25 public count reflects that reality. A coalition that can integrate land elements with maritime and air elements is rehearsing the full support structure behind any serious operation, not just the visible part on the water. Air and maritime coordination is another area where the exercise does real work. The air picture and the surface picture are not separate universes. They are related parts of one problem set. A ship sees one slice of the environment. An aircraft sees another. A submarine sees something else again. The exercise trains the coalition to stitch those slices together into a usable operational picture so that the force can act with better awareness than any single component can provide. Planning is where the coalition defines its intent. Force integration is where the participants learn whether that intent can survive contact with real systems and real habits. Live training is where the integration is stressed by actual movement, timing, and coordination. After-action learning is where the exercise becomes useful for the next time. Those are not the same phase, and they should not be confused with one another. A strong exercise treats them as a chain, not a single event. That chain is why a large exercise is a laboratory rather than a prediction. A laboratory is designed to expose relationships, test assumptions, and reveal failure points without pretending it can predict every outcome in the wild. RIMPAC cannot tell anyone exactly how a future conflict would unfold. It can, however, show where the coalition is strong, where it is thin, and where the seams still need work. That is the proper value of the exercise. What it can prove is real, though limited. It can show whether partners can assemble around a common plan. It can show whether command relationships are understandable. It can show whether communications and logistics function across national boundaries. It can show whether medical support, replenishment, and coordination can hold up under a demanding schedule. It can show whether the coalition can learn quickly while the exercise is still underway. What it cannot prove is just as important. It cannot prove how any future conflict would begin. It cannot prove that every capability will work the same way under entirely different conditions. It cannot remove uncertainty from the Pacific, or from international politics, or from the human element of war. A maritime exercise is not a forecast. It is a rehearsal of methods, habits, and relationships that may matter in many different situations, none of which can be fully predicted. The change from 31 nations in April planning material to 30 nations in the June 25 public release is a useful reminder of that. Planning is living work. Nations adjust commitments. Approvals move. Timing shifts. Public counts are not stand-ins for a fixed future. They are snapshots of the force as it is actually being presented at a given moment. That is not a weakness. It is the normal behavior of a coalition exercise built around real governments and real armed forces. That same fact points to a deeper lesson. Coalition readiness is not a static property that can be declared and then assumed forever. It is something built through interaction. Every conference, every coordination event, every working group, every rehearsal, and every review adds to it. The 30th iteration matters because it shows the exercise is a continuing system of learning, not a one-time demonstration of competence. A long-running exercise also becomes a memory system. Since 1971, RIMPAC has accumulated a record of what works, what fails, what needs translation, and what needs patience. The point is not nostalgia. The point is that a coalition can get better at being a coalition over time, if it takes the lessons seriously. That is why the exercise continues to matter after decades. It keeps converting experience into practice. Interoperability, in this setting, is the ability to make different things work together without pretending they are the same thing. That difference is easy to miss and easy to misuse. If you assume interchangeability, you start expecting one force to act exactly like another, and that is where disappointment begins. If you understand interoperability, you respect the differences while still building effective cooperation. RIMPAC rehearses that discipline across platforms, staffs, and national systems. Think of the coalition as a mosaic, not a clone. Each piece keeps its own shape and color. The value comes from the way the pieces fit. A mosaic does not succeed by making every tile identical. It succeeds by making difference useful. That is the deeper logic of a multinational maritime exercise. It does not erase national identity. It makes national identity workable inside a combined effort. Much of this work is invisible to the public because the visible part is the easiest part to describe. Ships sail, aircraft fly, submarines take part, land forces join in. The quieter work is the standard setting, the terminology alignment, the permissions, the logistics, the medical coordination, and the trust building. That invisible work is not secondary. It is what makes the visible work possible and credible. The public Navy descriptions are useful because they show how broad the training really is. Maritime security, sea control, air defense, anti-submarine warfare, disaster relief, medicine, and mine clearance training are not random labels. Together they describe a coalition that has to be able to protect access, manage risk, support people, and survive friction. That breadth is one reason the exercise is worth studying. It is a map of how maritime power connects to much more than combat alone. Medicine, in particular, shows that readiness is human before it is mechanical. Navy Medicine's July 2026 report about the multinational symposium is a good reminder that coalitions are also networks of care. A force that can learn together on medical issues is a force that can handle stress with more confidence. The ability to share medical knowledge, align procedures, and strengthen interoperability is not a side benefit. It is part of the real foundation of coalition endurance. Humanitarian response reinforces that point. When a coalition rehearses disaster relief, it is rehearsing the ability to move help quickly and coherently. That includes communications, transport, coordination, and the ability to work with partners who may not share the same systems. It also reinforces the public side of coalition life. A force that can help after a disaster demonstrates why cooperation matters beyond warfighting. That matters strategically because relationships are strengthened when they prove useful in more than one kind of crisis. The Pacific setting gives all of this extra weight. Maritime security in that region is not an abstract concept. It is tied to movement, trade, reassurance, and the ability of many countries to operate without intimidation. A multinational exercise in that environment is not just training for a tactical problem. It is also a demonstration that partners can organize themselves around shared interests and shared responsibilities in a large and demanding maritime space. The large scale is important, but not because bigger automatically means better. It matters because scale introduces friction. More nations mean more coordination. More platforms mean more interfaces. More people mean more relationships to manage. The exercise therefore tests something deeper than platform performance. It tests whether a coalition can absorb complexity without losing clarity. That is a more serious measure of readiness than simple presence ever could be. A lot of the value is in the gap between planning and execution. Planning conferences set the frame. Force integration tests the frame. Live training reveals what the frame can survive. After-action learning refines the next frame. That sequence is why the exercise keeps returning. It is not trying to capture a perfect moment. It is trying to make the coalition better at adapting from one iteration to the next. That adaptation is what turns a multinational exercise into a serious instrument. The point is not to declare that every nation has become identical, or every system can replace every other system. The point is to show that different systems can be coordinated, different authorities can be respected, and different national contributions can be brought into one coherent effort. That is the practical meaning of interoperability, and it is what RIMPAC rehearses in public view. It is also why planning estimates should be treated carefully. The April material saying 31 nations was not a failure of planning. It was a sign that coalition participation is not frozen months ahead of time. The June 25th count of 30 nations is the public number that should be used for the exercise as announced. That change reminds us that exercises are not fiction. They are organized around real approvals, real constraints, and real national decisions that can move until the public release is fixed. That realism is part of what makes the exercise useful. The exercise environment is complex, but it is still bounded enough to reveal patterns. You can see whether relationships hold. You can see whether support chains work. You can see whether the coalition can make decisions quickly enough and communicate clearly enough to stay coherent. Those are the kinds of lessons that matter across many future contingencies, not just one. A serious coalition also learns how to be patient with itself. Not every gap is a crisis. Not every difference is a weakness. Some differences are just the reality of sovereign forces working together. The exercise teaches participants where to standardize, where to translate, and where to respect national variation. That is one of the more mature forms of military professionalism, because it avoids the false comfort of pretending all forces are interchangeable. So the visible answer to what RIMPAC is really rehearsing is a coalition of ships, aircraft, submarines, and land forces. The deeper answer is a coalition of relationships, authorities, procedures, and habits of mind. It is rehearsing command relationships, communications, data sharing, logistics, maintenance, replenishment, medical support, and the political discipline of operating together without pretending to be one nation. It is rehearsing the ability to work through uncertainty without breaking trust. And that is why the exercise still matters after so many iterations. The ships will come and go. The public count will change from year to year. The mix of participants will adjust. But the core task remains the same. A multinational maritime exercise has to teach many different forces how to become a coherent working whole for long enough to matter. That is what the June 25th count, the planning conferences, the broad training set, and the long history since 1971 are all pointing toward. In the end, RIMPAC is not rehearsing a parade, and it is not rehearsing a prediction. It is rehearsing coalition competence. It is rehearsing the hard, practical, unglamorous work of making different forces understandable to one another, usable together, and resilient under pressure. That is the real lesson in the numbers, the history, and the public descriptions. That is what the exercise is really rehearsing. Scale changes the meaning of a naval exercise. When a few ships train together, people can solve many problems through familiarity. When dozens of ships, aircraft, land forces, and national staffs arrive from different institutions, familiarity is no longer enough. The exercise has to create shared expectations quickly. People need to know who has authority, what information matters, how a report is formatted, which assumptions are safe, and where a national procedure ends and a combined arrangement begins. That is why the most important work often happens before the ships leave port. Planning conferences are not ceremonial meetings attached to the real event. They are part of the operational system. U.S. Pacific Fleet descriptions of RIMPAC planning emphasize relationships, synchronization, and shared objectives, because a multinational force cannot improvise its basic structure at sea. Planning creates a common vocabulary before pressure arrives. It also creates a place where differences can be exposed while they are still cheap to resolve. Those differences are normal. Nations may use different equipment, reporting habits, legal authorities, medical systems, fuel arrangements, and rules for releasing information. Even when everyone speaks English, the same word can carry a different operational meaning. Interoperability is therefore more than connecting radios or displaying the same track. It is the ability to understand one another well enough to make a decision together without erasing the national responsibilities each force still carries. That distinction matters because interoperability is not identical to interchangeability. Interchangeability suggests that one unit can simply replace another and produce the same result. A coalition rarely works that way. One navy may bring a particular sensor, another a ship suited to air defense, another a medical capability, and another a specialized aircraft. Their value comes from how the pieces connect, not from pretending they are identical. RIMPAC rehearses the connections. The public 2026 numbers make that challenge visible. The June 25th release lists 30 nations, more than 30 surface ships, 5 submarines, 15 national land forces, more than 206 aircraft, and 30,000 personnel. Those figures describe scale, not a single order of battle or a permanent force. They tell us that coordination has to happen across ships, airfields, headquarters, medical facilities, ports, and training areas. A number that large is useful only if the organization can turn it into understandable relationships. Logistics is one of the clearest tests. A ship may arrive ready to train, but readiness is not a permanent state. Fuel, food, parts, maintenance windows, safe harbor services, communication support, and medical coverage all have to keep pace with the exercise. The public story tends to emphasize ships and aircraft because they are visible. The harder question is whether the support network can sustain multinational activity without creating hidden bottlenecks or asking one nation to quietly carry the whole burden. Medical interoperability makes the point in a different way. Navy Medicine's public account of the 2026 Multinational Medical Symposium describes professionals exchanging knowledge and strengthening support across partner nations. That is not a side story. A force that can maneuver together but cannot coordinate care, evacuation, documentation, or preventive medicine has not solved the full problem of operating together. Medical systems reveal whether trust exists at the level where people are most vulnerable. The same is true of communications and data. A combined force does not need every participant to own the same equipment. It needs the participants to understand what information can be shared, how it is labeled, how quickly it moves, and what confidence belongs with it. A perfect network cannot rescue a confused decision process. A modest network can be useful when the people connected to it share a disciplined way of thinking. RIMPAC therefore rehearses habits as much as hardware. The exercise also crosses different kinds of missions. Public Navy descriptions include maritime security, sea control, air defense, anti-submarine warfare, mine clearance, disaster relief, and humanitarian assistance. Those missions do not ask the same questions. A security patrol may emphasize identification and restraint. Air defense may emphasize speed and coordination. Disaster relief may emphasize access, medical support, and civilian safety. A force that can move between those missions without losing its common language is more adaptable than one that has practiced only a narrow combat scenario. This is why high-end training and humanitarian work belong in the same conversation. They test different parts of the organization, but they share a demand for coordination under pressure. In both cases, people must understand authority, logistics, safety, information, and the consequences of misunderstanding. A maritime exercise that includes humanitarian tasks is not lowering its seriousness. It is testing whether the coalition can use its power responsibly when the problem is not an enemy formation, but a damaged community or an overwhelmed support system. There is also a political layer. Every multinational exercise is a public statement about who is willing to show up, share risk, learn together, and be seen operating with others. That statement can be stronger than any single maneuver. It can reassure partners, expose differences, create domestic questions, and signal that cooperation has practical costs. RIMPAC rehearses trust, but it also measures the political willingness to keep investing in trust after the photographs are gone. The friction is part of the value. A coalition that never disagrees may simply be hiding its disagreements. Planning exposes different assumptions. Training exposes delays, translation problems, incompatible equipment, and unclear authority. Medical and logistics events expose gaps that a tactical demonstration can conceal. The useful outcome is not a claim that everything worked perfectly. It is a more accurate map of where cooperation is strong, where it is fragile, and what must be improved before the next crisis. That is why an exercise is not the same thing as a prediction. RIMPAC cannot prove how a specific future war would unfold, and public participation figures cannot be turned into a secret readiness score. The exercise uses controlled conditions to reveal habits and relationships. It creates evidence about cooperation without removing uncertainty from the world outside the exercise. A disciplined analysis should say what the available evidence demonstrates and leave the rest as an open question. The same caution applies to the phrase rehearsing for. It is tempting to assign one named adversary, or one imagined battle, to every complex maritime event. That makes a clean headline, but it hides the broader purpose. RIMPAC prepares forces to operate in a region where sea lanes, disaster response, deterrence, maritime security, and high-end conflict can overlap. Its value is flexibility. It is rehearsing the ability to build a combined force before anyone knows exactly which problem will demand it. After the ships return, the most important work continues. Teams compare what they expected with what actually happened. They examine delays, unclear reports, maintenance surprises, medical handoffs, staffing gaps, and decisions that took too long. A good after-action process does not protect reputations by declaring success. It protects the next operation by making failures legible while they are still fixable. Trust grows when partners can report friction without being punished for revealing it. That is the hidden center of RIMPAC. The ships and aircraft are real, but the exercise is ultimately about a temporary organization that has to become coherent quickly, operate safely, and learn honestly. The 30 nations are not valuable because the number looks impressive. They are valuable when the number represents relationships that can bear pressure. The exercise is not a parade, because a parade asks people to look aligned. RIMPAC asks them to become aligned enough to solve a problem together. So what is RIMPAC really rehearsing? It is rehearsing the difficult middle layer between national capability and combined action. It is rehearsing how commanders share authority, how crews share information, how logisticians share burdens, how medics share standards, and how partners preserve trust when equipment and assumptions do not match. It is rehearsing the discipline to train for combat, while retaining the ability to protect people, stabilize a crisis, and learn from mistakes. That is why the most revealing parts of a large maritime exercise may be the least cinematic: a planning table, a medical discussion, a maintenance delay, a translation question, a replenishment problem, or a commander deciding how much uncertainty is acceptable. Those moments show whether a coalition is becoming a force or merely occupying the same map. RIMPAC matters because it gives those relationships a place to be tested before the stakes become irreversible.